Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. This is Victoria Beal with the LTAP Center, and we are hosting this afternoon an update on ODOT's curb ramps. It's the ODOT's curb ramp updates webinar, and we have presenters Brenton Bogard and also Don Fisher, who will be available to answer questions and as you submit those while Brenton is presenting. So we're happy to have you on here, and we thank you for voting on the poll. We're going to take that down in just a few seconds, so if you could please finish up your voting on the poll so we have a good representation of who's on the webinar today, we'd appreciate it. While you're finishing up your voting, I want to mention that in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar panel, we do have a PDF for you of today's presentation. If for some reason, though, you're not able to download that, don't worry. I'll be sending out a follow-up email afterwards with a link to that handout as well. One last item before I take the poll down is I'd like to ask everybody who's on here to please find the question box and drop me a hi or hello in there, because that is where we're asking that you submit your questions. And I want to know that you've found that box and are able to send the questions in as they come to mind. And please feel free to send them throughout the webinar. It's going to be interactive in the sense that we'll be addressing the questions that are submitted. So if you have a question as Brett's presenting, please feel free to send that in. I'm going to go ahead and close our poll down now. 96% of you voted, thank you. And I'm going to share the results. We have with us today the highest percentage right now showing on the poll is consultants at 39%, followed very closely by our colleagues in state government at 36%. And we have an excellent representation from local government at 20%. And we have 4% of other, and then 1% are our partners from the federal government. So I'll hide those poll results. And we see Brett's slide there. So Brett, it's all yours.
All right, so you can see it now. Don't have to switch it again.
Yep, you're fine. We can see the slide, so you're good to go.
All right, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar, which, as Victoria said, will cover ODOT's recent guidance and standards updates related to curb ramps. I am Brent Bogard, Administrator in the Office of Roadway Engineering at ODOT's Central Office, and I have a few people joining me today as well who helped work on these updates and who may jump in with some additional information and help answer any questions. Don Fisher, Standards Engineer and our ADA expert in the Office of Roadway Engineering. Gary Angles, Administrator in the Office of Construction Administration. And Julie Miller, Construction Pavement Engineer, also in the Office of Construction Administration. So before I get into what changes were made regarding ODOT's guidance on curb ramps, I wanted to take a minute to explain why we made these changes and why it's important. A couple of years ago, ODOT inventoried all state-maintained ADA facilities, including curb ramps. And as you can see here, ODOT owns and maintains just over 4,600 curb ramps. Through this inventory process, we found that a significant percentage of curb ramps did not meet ADA standards, which is both a safety and legal concern for ODOT. Roadway Engineering selected a corridor of saturated, a corridor that was saturated with non-compliant curb ramps to study further and to try to understand why this was the case. We found that almost every single curb ramp in that corridor could have been designed and constructed to meet ADA standards. So applying that statewide, we realized there was a lot of room for improvement, and we organized a team of central office and district representatives, including people from planning, design, and construction, to brainstorm and implement ideas that would improve the application and compliance of ADA's curb ramp standards. The purpose of this webinar is to cover all of those ideas that were implemented in the July update just about a month ago. So the first big update was that we created a single online location for all ODOT ADA guidance, a new website to house references, standards, guidance, and training. So ODOT has ADA guidance spread out through many different manuals, guides, and standard drawings. And this effort collects all of those into one page and provides links to where all ODOT guidance on each ADA feature can be found. So if you go to Google and search ODOT ADA, it should be the first page listed in the results. The address is also listed on this slide. And as you can see, the web page contains pull-down tabs for every ADA design feature, including curb ramps. And each of these pull-down tabs contain numerous links to where you can find all ODOT's guidance and standards related to that ADA design feature. On the right side of the page is a link to a document called ADA Update, What Changed in July, which provides an executive summary of all the recent updates. And this webinar will cover each of the 8 points listed in that document, with the first being the new ADA resource website. The second update involved making some minor changes to the Office of Traffic Operations Signal Design Reference Packet, or SDRP. We added a link to ORE's ADA Design Resource webpage to page 2, the reference page. We also added ADA checks to the detailed design and review submission stages checklist. And we updated the ADA push button and structure diagram and design notes to remind designers of ADA requirements. Number 3, and maybe the most substantial update, is that we created an ADA waiver process to evaluate, review, approve, and retain a waiver for locations where the construction of an ADA compliant curb ramp is determined to be infeasible. We've broken this update out into 6 subparts, with the first being that we updated the guidance in Location and Design Volume 1, Section 300 to include information on when a waiver is allowed. So please see L&D Volume 1, Section 306.1.1, Exceptions to PROAG for more information. It goes through the next few bullet points, summarizing the next few bullet points. It's not always practicable to fully meet ADA dimensional requirements, which is acknowledged by PROAG. Even if a curb ramp is eligible for a waiver, it still needs to be constructed to meet ADA requirements to the maximum extent possible. So if one design element can't meet ADA standards, the waiver doesn't allow the designer to forego meeting all the other design requirements. Disproportionate cost to provide an accessible path of travel can be a factor in a decision to deviate from ADA requirements. Disproportionate cost is defined to be the additional cost of alterations to provide an accessible path of travel to the altered area is disproportionate when it exceeds 20% of the cost of the alteration to the primary function area. And that is taken directly from PROAG and was added to L&D 1, Section 306.1.1. In cases where it is not practicable to meet all ADA dimensional requirements, the constraints are required to be documented in an ADA waiver form. The district design engineer is responsible for the review and approval or denial of all ADA waivers. A project's scope and purpose and need should be a consideration when evaluating an ADA waiver. The scope of the project can be an important consideration in determining if meeting ADA requirements is practicable. For example, resurfacing projects are considered alteration projects that require the updating of pedestrian curb ramps. And if the scope of a resurfacing project does not require the purchase of additional right-of-way, it is not practicable to purchase right-of-way. The project should make as many ramps as fully compliant to ADA requirements as possible without the purchase of right-of-way. Those ramps not meeting the ADA requirements must have an approved ADA waiver form completed and signed by the district design engineer. Future projects at a location with a waiver should determine whether the curb ramp could be made compliant based on the scope of the project, while recognizing that there are some locations that it may never be possible to make the ramps fully compliant. And a waiver is a last resort. It's a way to document ODOT's design and construction decisions not a loophole to provide substandard curb ramp designs. We created a curb ramp evaluation form to assist planning, design, and construction personnel in evaluating ADA compliance of curb ramps. So here's a screenshot of what the form looks like, and it can be found on the ADA Design Resource webpage under the curb ramp pull down. Field personnel can use ODOT's curb ramp evaluation form to help inspect and review curb ramps. And you could also use a printout of the waiver form to help with inspection and review. Also part of the waiver update, we created a waiver workflow. The workflow provides a step-by-step guide to all users and covers the entire waiver process. It can be found on the ADA Design Resource page in the right-hand column and is titled ADA Lifecycle Handoffs with Waiver. The flowchart applies both to facilities maintained locally and those maintained by ODOT. The flowchart details the steps required to process an ADA waiver, whether the need is identified during planning, design, or construction. At any point in the design process, when the designer becomes aware that it is not feasible to make a curb ramp compliant, they should notify the ODOT project manager to start the waiver process. Each ramp that does not meet ADA requirements should have an approved ADA waiver form completed and signed by the district design engineer. If another project is carried out at the same location, like I said before, the designer should determine whether the scope of the project will allow making the ramp compliant. And ODOT recognizes that it may never be possible to make ramps fully compliant in some locations. So here's the process for obtaining a waiver while in the design phase. The designer notifies the ODOT project manager. The ODOT project manager completes the ADA waiver form. The district design engineer reviews and approves the waiver request and notifies the ODOT project manager. The ODOT project manager adds the new ADA asset into the collector app with the status of proposed. The project manager adds the ADA design waiver to the proposed ramp, and then the overnight script creates a new unique ID for the ramp and adds LRS info to the record in the collector app, and then the designer submits and completes final plans for the final tracings. This is just a sample workflow, and the districts can assign the different responsibilities as far as who fills out the waiver form or who updates the collector app, but the approval or denial of the waiver form is ultimately the design engineer's responsibility. A construction project cannot move forward without an approved waiver for each non-compliant curb ramp. Waivers approved during the design phase should be listed in the general notes and on the title sheet of the plans. So here's the process for obtaining a waiver during the construction phase. The contractor notifies the ODOT project engineer of a non-compliant curb ramp. The ODOT project engineer notifies the district project manager who completes the ADA waiver form. The district design engineer reviews and approves the waiver request. The district project manager adds the waiver to the ramp in the collector app. When the project is completed, the district TAM coordinator changes the ramp's asset status from proposed to active. And finally, the district TAM coordinator changes the status of any assets replaced or eliminated to retired. Again, this is just a sample workflow, and the districts can assign the different responsibilities as they see fit outside of the waiver approval, which again can only be made by the design engineer. The fourth subpart of the waiver process update is the creation of the waiver form itself, which is set up in FormStack. And I think currently access is restricted to only the district design engineers, but it can be opened up to a few other users per district, but it's not intended to be something everyone has access to the electronic version of anyway. The electronic ADA waiver form is used to submit, approve, record, and retain information on waivers. A hard copy could be printed and used to collect information and then submitted to whoever is assigned with filling the form out. The form requires the final review and signature of the district design engineer, but may be based on information gathered by other personnel to be determined by each district. If there is an ADA waiver for a feature, it should be noted on the title sheet and additional details provided in the general notes. In the general notes, the ramp ID, approval date, sheet number, and reasons for the waiver will be detailed. And I'll cover those later in the presentation. The fifth subpart of this update involved modifying the ADA collector app to house the approved waivers. Once completed, waivers are attached to an individual curb ramp. The collector app is used to store information about ODOT maintained facilities covered by the ADA. And you can access the collector app at the ODOT website, but you will need a My ODOT account if you don't have one already. And if you don't have one, you can contact your district TAM coordinator to sign up for an account. And there is a user guide on the application that you can reference as well. So for example, this screenshot is from the collector app, and the green dot shows an item in the sidewalk inventory, and the blue dot shows an item in the curb ramp inventory. You can click on the dots to see all the information related to a particular curb ramp, including its dimensions, measurements, and any pictures that have been taken. This will also be where the waiver form is stored. The sixth and last subpart of the waiver process update included updating the construction plan title sheet to include a note on whether or not there are any curb ramps that have waivers within the project. And if so, a general note should be added to describe the curb ramp and waiver in more detail. So in L&D Volume 3, Section 1302.15, this section shows the formatting that should be used when noting whether or not there are any ADA design waivers on the project, and includes references on where the updated sample title sheet and sample plan note can be found. On sample plan sheet 1302.1, you can see here highlighted in red what it looks like just below the design designation and design exception information. As shown on the previous slide, it should just say required or not required, and the general notes can add more detail. In L&D Volume 1, Appendix B, Roadway Sample Plan Notes, you can find Sample Plan Note R128, ADA Waiver, which lists the ramp ID number, the approval date of the waiver, and which sheets the ramps are located on. Update number 4 included updating Section 300 of L&D Volume 1 to provide additional design guidance for optimum curb ramp selection. Curb ramps were divided into tiers with preferences listed. So curb ramps come in 5 basic types. Tier 1 is considered to be the most desirable, and Tier 4 the least desirable, with the blended transition as an additional design option. Tier 1 is the perpendicular curb ramp shown here. This is generally the best design for pedestrians, provided that a landing of at least 4 foot wide is available for each approach. Tier 2 is a combined ramp, which is basically 2 ramps in one. This design can be advantageous when dealing with a narrow sidewalk or steep grade, but these may be more expensive and complicated to install. Tier 3 is the parallel curb ramp. Parallel ramp should only be used where the space between the curb and property line is too tight to permit the installation of both a ramp and a landing. Parallel ramp may be necessary on steep terrain or in locations with high curbs. Tier 4 is the diagonal curb ramp. A diagonal curb ramp is located at the apex of the street corner. The disadvantage is that it may direct a visually impaired person away from the crosswalk and into traffic. A diagonal ramp may not be used if the radius is less than 20 feet. And a diagonal ramp is not an acceptable design for access to new sidewalks, but may be acceptable in retrofit locations where perpendicular ramps cannot be constructed. And lastly are blended transitions. So blended transitions are useful when the right-of-way at the radius area is very limited and a single landing area at the bottom is the most feasible option. Update number 5 includes no longer solely relying on referring to standard construction drawings and requiring, at minimum, a plan view of curb ramp layouts and construction plans. An example plan sheet is available on the ADA Design Resource webpage under the Curb Ramp pull-down tab. Curb ramp updates are mostly made in resurfacing type projects, so designers typically have a low level of survey data. The data may come from LiDAR or just by gathering field measurements with a smart level. When designing a curb ramp, you must detail it as shown in ODOT's sample plan sheet. And this includes proposed dimensions, slopes, and cross slopes, and elevations if available. On projects where you do have a higher level of survey data available, you should add elevation information as well. Update number 6 involved adding a tolerance or buffer to a few of the design standards to account for slight inaccuracies in either design or construction. Meeting ADA standards is black and white. You either meet or you don't. So rather than designing everything to the absolute minimum or maximum, we've made ODOT's ramp cross slope and ramp slope design requirements slightly more conservative than PROAG standards. The slope values for cross slope changed from a maximum of 2% to 1.56%, or from 50 to 1 to 64 to 1. And ramp slope or grade changed from a maximum of 8.33% to 7.69%, or from 12 to 1 to 13 to 1. We also updated the sidewalk slope to match, so there isn't a lip created between the sidewalk and curb ramp area. And very important here, if PROAG standards are met, a waiver is not required, even if ODOT standards are not met. Update number 7, to help prevent a ramp from being completed before any construction issues are identified, construction checkpoints were created to ensure communication between ODOT and the contractors happening. These changes have been added to the construction manual of procedures. ODOT has created a checkpoints process to evaluate the compliance of curb ramp during construction. Checkpoints are points in the construction sequence where construction should briefly pause so that the ramp can be evaluated to make sure it complies with safety guidelines. MOP section 608.07 was updated to note ODOT's goal of constructing ADA compliant curb ramps and to also reference the new checkpoint form CAC3 ADA construction checkpoints. Form CAC3 lists 3 major checkpoints: an initial review, an approval of layout, and a final inspection, with each of these checkpoints containing a list of several sub-items the inspector should be checking. Links to the MOP and inspection form can be found on the ADA Design Resource webpage. And field personnel should use ODOT's curb ramp evaluation form to inspect and review curb ramps. Update number 8 included creating 4 ADA curb ramp training videos, which can be found under the Training pull-down tab on the ADA Design Resource website. The videos cover all the updates ODOT has made regarding ADA curb ramp design, including individual videos specific to design, the waiver process, and construction inspection. And many of the slides in this presentation came from those videos, but the videos do provide more detail. So in summary, we've made these updates to try to improve ODOT's adherence to ADA curb ramp standards. They may not be enough, or it may be overkill, but we will adapt based on feedback we get from planning, design, and construction in the districts, as well as central office and locals. So feel free to reach out, let us know how it's going, any issues or gaps in the guidance that we can fill in. It may not be perfect, but we think it should get us headed in the right direction. So with that, Victoria, I think we can go ahead and open it up for questions.
We've had quite a few that have come into the question pod, so I don't know if Dawn wants to start going over some of those.
Sure. We have actually quite a few questions that relate to who the guidance applies to. If it's a local LET project, if, however ODOT is involved, if we're involved in design, are we involved in construction, then what's the process going forward in those instances? In general, when ODOT is involved, then we would follow the process that we kind of just laid out here. I don't know, you can feel free to jump in, Brenton, whenever, if you want. If it's a local road, it's local LET, and ODOT's not involved, then we wouldn't be collecting any waivers or anything like that, but you should be documenting why you couldn't make a ramp ADA compliant for your own records. But if ODOT is involved and say we're doing construction inspection, then we would go through the process. If a ramp needed a waiver and it was identified in construction, we would add it to the collector app. We would only collect ramps that needed waivers. We could collect more if we wanted to, but we need the ramp that has a waiver or would need a waiver for our records. So the next time we come through, we would be able to identify that this ramp was non-compliant, but these were the reasons why that it's not compliant. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Brenton. I know this was kind of an issue we went back and forth on quite a bit.
I think you covered it, and I would just add that right now the collector app, locals are not able to access, but I think it's something that ODOT is working on, so that they could add their curb ramp or waiver information at a future date. I think that's in the works.
Right, and for the consultants who might not be familiar with the collector app, it's really an inventory app, web app that we have. It's also an app that we have on iPads that have a whole host of assets, ODOT assets listed on them, and ADA curb ramps being one of those assets. But we also have barriers and all kinds of other things that we've collected there. And that collector app itself isn't necessarily available to everyone, but our dashboard is.
Brenton, there's about 10 more questions I've sent over to Don while he was speaking. So one person though asked if you could please go over the slope changes again. So maybe if you could go back over those while Don's reading through the additional questions.
Yeah, and the handout is available, and it should have all these slides that I went through. So you can download that and reference this anytime. But the standard construction drawing, as well as the L&D Volume 1, were updated to reflect these slopes. So just to reiterate, the ODOT slopes here are slightly more conservative than what ProAg's standards are. So we're striving to meet ODOT standards, But in the case that you fall somewhere between ODOT and PROAG, but you're still meeting PROAG, that would not require a waiver. So just to reiterate that, it's important, I guess. But was there a specific question, or they just wanted to see the slide again?
It sounds like they just wanted to see that slide again, have you go back over it again.
Sure. Hopefully that helped.
Dawn, do you want me to start reading some of these questions off and you guys can just address them?
Well, I have, sure, but there's one in here about right of way that I wanted to address. Whether the lack of right of way is a reason for a waiver, and it is a reason for a waiver if, say, you have a resurfacing project and we're not purchasing right of way on that project. We have no right of way that we're purchasing on the project, but this ramp would require right of way. Then that would be a reason for a waiver. Now, at some point in the future, if you have a project that you are purchasing right away, or you could work it into the scope of another project, we would hope that you could go back and address that ramp. So,
and there's language in the L&D Volume 1, Section 300 that goes over that a little bit more in depth of when a waiver would be appropriate. And like I mentioned here, the scope and purpose and need of a project can factor into that. So just did want to add that.
Okay, I'm just going to start at the top and start running down. If it's something you've already answered, then just tell me to go on to the next one. Are there specific notes to be used for curb ramps approved by waiver?
There is the title sheet should denote that there's a waiver on the project, and then within the general notes of the construction plans, it should provide details on a ramp that doesn't meet compliance. So yeah, we don't have any specific notes other than what Brent has shown right now.
Yes,
Okay.
I don't know. That's why I was trying to hold the questions till the end, because some of these topics overlapped and I mentioned them earlier and then covered in more detail later. So depending on what, hopefully that question was answered once I got to this section of the presentation.
Okay. Existing sidewalks where the maximum ramp slope is not feasible due to site constraints, for example, utility poles or vaults, right-of-way limits may be reduced as follows: 10:1 for a maximum rise of 6 inches and 8:1 for maximum rise of 3 inches. I guess that's more of a comment there.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we
have
go
ahead.
That's in the standard construction drawing also, where you, because of those conditions, it gives a couple different slopes that you can use for short periods of time.
Okay, if a project is at stage 3, does the sidewalk and curb ramp design have to change to the new standards?
No, it's I think and Don, I'm not sure the official language, but basically we implemented this guidance July 17th and said if you can fit it into a project that's already in the design phase, please do so to the maximum extent possible. But it's required for any project scoped and starting design after July 17th. So if you're at stage 3, try to comply. I mean, ADA is still the law. It's just you won't have to follow these updates for waiver form and that kind of thing. But try to design to the maximum extent possible. But all new projects from July 17th forward should be following these guidelines.
Unless there's unreasonable cost or scheduling delays that would be associated with that.
Right.
Okay. Another question. Seems like most issues with curb ramps are due to contractor not constructing correctly. Will there be an effort to share this information with contractors to get them to build them correctly?
I'm sure there's some contractors on the call too. But we have shared this information with our construction department here, and Gary's on the call, so he's been involved in these updates as well. And I think they would argue there's just as much fault in design and us relying on designers only providing a standard construction drawing to detail the curb ramps. So that was one of the reasons why we switched to at least providing a 2D design of curb ramps. We didn't take it fully to requiring elevations and all that, but it's kind of a halfway, meeting halfway and providing something more than just the standard construction drawing. But to answer the question, yes, we've been involving construction and trying to get the word out to the OCA as well.
Gary, I see that you unmuted. Do you want to make a comment there?
I'll just make a comment. This is Gary, and we've reached out to the district construction engineers last month at the meeting, and we have another one coming up next week. We'll echo the same message. Brett was at that one. OCA attends our district construction engineers meeting, and they were, heard the message. I'm sure there's still going to be contractors that haven't all heard the message, and we will continue to carry that message forward. So we're early in these changes, and we will continue to spread the news.
Thank you. Next question, is ODOT updating the guidelines for time per sheet for the additional details that are needed to lay out and design the curb ramps?
We have not yet. It was something that we were looking into, but that should be something considered by districts and consultants when preparing fee proposals for construction plans. It's a good question.
Next question. It says 6-to-1 over a maximum run of 2 foot to 0 inches for historic areas where a flatter scope is not feasible. I guess that's a continuation of that earlier one that I thought was just a comment. It says these 3 conditions are mentioned in section 306.1.1 of L&D exceptions to PROAG. Can you expand or explain these 3 conditions?
Yeah, I think we already addressed that one. It's in the standard drawing, and it's in section 300 as well.
Okay. Next question. If you get a waiver because you needed right-of-way, do you go back later and put the ramp in with right-of-way?
I think I talked about that one as well. If you have a project that requires right-of-way to construct the ramp, and there isn't any other right-of-way required on the project, then that is a ramp that is eligible for a waiver, with the expectation that at some point in the future, when you have another project, that you could incorporate that into the scope. You would do it at some point in the future.
Okay, next question. You measure the width of the ramp for the collector. Why isn't the length of the ramp to the landing measured?
I'm not familiar with what all is collected in the collector app as far as the measurements. Don, do you know if the length is?
Usually we're primarily concerned with the slopes, and so we're in general, we haven't been adding that length of the ramp, but mostly to get that slope correct. And that's right, we have not been collecting that information on the length of the landing, length of the ramp itself.
Next question. Will we need a waiver for tying into existing non-compliant sidewalk cross slopes outside of the ramps?
That's a good question. I would think if the curb ramp itself is meeting, but then the sidewalk slope, I mean, I would lean towards no if the area of the curb ramp is meeting ADA standards, and then you're fix so many feet of sidewalk to tie into, and then you transition into a non-compliant sidewalk slope, then I would think you wouldn't need a waiver for the curb ramp. Don, I don't know if you
I
feel
would
the
agree
same
with
way.
that. The waiver process is really for a curb ramp. If you start adding the sidewalk part of it too, how far are you going to chase it? So really for this app and this update, we're really just concerned with the curb ramps themselves.
Well, hopefully that answers this next question too, but I'll read it off anyway. It says, how do you handle, quote, chasing grade, end quote, for the design of a curb ramp? For instance, my roadway profile is nearly 6%, and a 15-foot curb ramp would result in nearly a 14% slope of the ramp. Would this require completing the waiver form, or should I extend the ramp to be able to meet 5.69% max slope? Is there a maximum length we cap the ramps at?
Yes, you don't have to chase these indefinitely. I believe it's a 15-foot section. So there are a lot of areas out there where we're building brand new curb ramps and the sidewalk is in less than good shape. So we wouldn't continue the sidewalk work unless it was part of the scope of the project indefinitely. But the ramp itself, I believe it's 15 feet, and that's in the standard drawing.
Okay, it seems like there was quite a few of them similar in nature right there in a row. So I'm going to move on to what looks like another topic here. These design guidelines will require designers to provide very specific pavement elevation details in construction plans. These details need to be included as a specific task in all SAFE profiles in the consultant fee guidance. Who owns that and when will it be implemented?
The Office of Consultant Services maintains the consultant fee guideline. I forget what the official name of it is, but again, we answered a similar question earlier on that. Yes, the consultant fee guidance in SAFE and some tasks need to be looked at to see. They do require a little bit more work, so the fee should be adjusted accordingly.
Okay, question, can you build a ramp that is not compliant? If so, slope exceeds requirement.
You can build a
Can you-
non-compliant ramp with a waiver if you have if there's an eligible waiver for that ramp. So in some cases, even though we can't get a ramp compliant, we would still like to make improvements as much as possible.
Okay,
So
another question. Sorry. Another question, where is the best place to find direction on what types of projects would require the study of existing curb ramps and require them to be updated if the project does not impact them? For example, a resurfacing project with no impacts on the existing sidewalk and curb ramps. Do the existing ramps need studied and updated if non-compliant?
Resurfacing projects are an alteration, so they would trigger looking at curb ramps, and I think that's the typical project that we run into that we address curb ramps. So resurfacing projects are probably the ones that we see most of curb ramp alterations on.
Question, how does ODOT guidance compare to other states? Does ProAg promote Tier 1 over Tier 4? Do some states prefer Tier 4 compared to Tier 1?
Tier 4 is the diagonal ramp, and that's really not allowed anywhere. It's really frowned upon nationally and only allowed where you have an existing ramp and there's there's an existing feature that you're kind of working around. So yeah, the diagonal ramp is really to be avoided wherever possible, and it's really kind of, if nothing else will work, that's what we want to go to.
Okay, question. In my area, there are many gas line replacement projects. During those projects, many times only one ramp at an intersection is accounted for. If the other ramps are non-compliant, would ODOT require the gas companies to remove and replace the other curb ramps at the intersection?
I think that goes back to the purpose and need of the project. If it is the resurfacing project, or is this just strictly a gas line replacement project, then that goes. The scope and the purpose and need of the project is considered when applying for or approving a waiver.
Okay, next question. Who is expected to verify as-built compliance? Is this a contractor responsibility, ODOT Construction Administration, or other?
Gary, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
I was hoping Julie was there, but I'll give it a shot. And Julie, you chime in. When it occurs, different types, pre-construction, we'll bring it up then. And this construction checkpoints, the 3 different times, we talk about it when proposed layout, the initial review, and then we talk about it when, we form it up, we're out in the field. And then when we get ready to pour it, at the end, everything it's checked, it's communication, it's, working with the contractor to make sure that it is in compliance as we go through. And that's the process. It's in our manual procedures, very clear what needs to occur. We even talk about the types of levels, 4-foot levels, smart levels we use. When practical, if we have to use a 2-foot, we'll use it in certain locations. It's very clear on what we're looking for to achieve those slopes and requirements. And Julie, you're welcome to chime in if you're on the line.
I'm here, Gary.
Okay.
I think you covered it very well. We are taking a very hard look at our ADA compliance in the field. And as Brenton and Gary pointed out, we have a thoroughly detailed checklist that we are requiring for ramps. We feel this will be the first time we've used that. We feel that it is a good first step. And of course, it could be an evolutionary process where we revise that as we go along. But as Gary pointed out, it will be communication between the contractor, the project people, and the design engineer in the district. So we feel like we have a good process in place. We will, of course, evaluate that and continually update that process to make improvements as we go along.
Okay, next question. Will contingency quantities be added to plans to account for any field adjustments?
I don't know. I mean, that contingency for.
This is Gary again, it's set up on a square foot, and if it requires additional length or width or whatever, we write change orders all the time. So the details and the plans would be great if they were exact, but I don't think we've ever had a plan with the exact width, lengths. We've always had to field adjust, and that's where our project engineers in the field will be, agreeing upon quantities. So yes, we don't plan on putting contingency quantities in. We plan on being within the contract, regular work change order limits, but if it goes over, it goes over.
Okay, we have a question here that says, to go back to the local implications of this process. For example, on an ODOT-let resurfacing project through a city, i.e. urban paving, on a state route, will the city be required to meet these requirements?
The answer is yes. If they're, as far as the waiver compliance, yes. There are cities that have different standards for curb ramps. As long as those meet PROAG, they can still have their own standards. But urban paving projects, that's been one that's kind of been an issue in the past, getting these compliant. And we're encouraging our districts to work with locals up front so that we can identify ramps that will need to be replaced, so there's no sticker shock when they get out there and they discover that there's a bunch of ramps that need to be replaced.
Okay, the next two questions kind of, I believe, speak to the same thing, so I'm going to read both of them. The first one is, will crosswalks, side road profiles also need to meet ADA requirements, i.e. a 1.56% cross slope on side road to create a bench? And then the next question is, the difference between a 2% and a 1.56% cross slope on a 4-foot wide ramp is 0.2 of an inch. Is this a realistic construction tolerance?
Well, the tolerance, like we said, is just to provide any kind of buffer that we can of any slight inaccuracy. So trying to design and construct to something that's slightly more conservative hopefully gives a little more room for error than if you just started with the 2% and then didn't meet that. So is it realistic? Obviously, it's a very small difference, but hopefully it provides just a little bit more room for error. Don, I don't know if you wanted to cover the first half of that question.
Yeah, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Sure. Will crosswalks, side road profiles also need to meet ADA requirements? For example, 1.56% cross slope on side road to create a bench.
Yeah, we didn't change any of the guidance as far as existing regulations for waivers. We're just documenting really situations where we can't get ADA compliance. So all of the current existing guidelines are still in play.
Okay, and there's one question seems to keep repeating itself here. There's a couple of people want to know, do the local or ODOT fill out the construction checkpoints if a local is administering the project? And if so, are the ADA forms available through Go Forms?
This is Gary again, and they're not in Go Forms at this time. It's a worksheet form, and I mean, we can eventually work there, but they are on the website so that you can print them off and physically just fill them out, and you can always scan them and put them in. We use SharePoint as our documentation folder, and I don't know what the locals do, but they can store it after they hard copy and print it off.
Okay, next question. What is the minimum cross slope for a ramp or landing area? What is the minimum longitudinal slope for a ramp? If you go below 5%, is it no longer a ramp, correct?
If you go below 5%, then you've kind of created a blended transition, which is also a good asset to have out there. You don't need a landing with a blended transition, so there's a lot of advantages that go with that.
Okay, we have one proofreading comment, which I'll save it for you guys for later. I think we've pretty well covered all the questions that were in there. We will be sending all of the questions to the presenters. Are waivers going to be rolled out for other ADA assets as well in the near future?
We kind of started at that, and then we really slimmed it down to just curb ramps. So that's a good question to be determined. We do have some statistics on our ADA compliance for some of the other ADA design features. So it is something we are considering, but curb ramps were by far the most of those ADA assets, and with those statistics of non-compliance, that's what we wanted to focus on for now. So maybe in the future.
Okay. There is one question that Peter has submitted. I'm going to make sure you guys see. Didn't want Peter to think I was skipping him, but it's very specific to his project. So I thought you guys could address that with him offline. So, okay.
Sure.
Well, I'll make sure that the rest of, all these questions get to the presenters, and I'm sure they can put together an additional frequently asked questions list if they feel that your questions, warrant that level of response here. So, or if they're comfortable that you've gotten the answers through the webinar, you will be getting a link to the recording of the webinar, hopefully still this afternoon. And we are going to do some replays of the webinar. So know that if your colleagues missed it, you can let them know it's going to be replayed and they can watch a replay. And while they can't ask questions live, we'll get a question list after the replay is completed that will provide over to the presenters to address. And anyone who participates in a replay gets a certificate as well. So I think we've got everything addressed here. So we'll go ahead. If there's nothing else that you guys wanted to add content-wise, we can wrap things up a little early.
I think I'm good, Victoria.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who was on the call today as presenters and also attendees. Hopefully this has answered quite a few questions that we've been hearing about for years, and we appreciate your time and the effort you made to be present on this live version of the webinar. Thank you, everyone. Take care.